Jack Daniel's is the best-selling American whiskey in the world, with over 150 years of history and a story so well-crafted it became American mythology. Except the man the legend was built around wasn't the one who built it. The real architect of Jack Daniel's spent 150 years being written out of his own creation. A young boy named Jasper Newton Daniel arrives at a Tennessee preacher's farm in the 1850s, working as a chore boy after leaving a difficult home. The preacher notices something in him and takes him under his wing to teach him the craft. Under that guidance, Jack develops a whiskey so smooth it wins the gold medal at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, beating 24 entries from around the world to be declared the finest whiskey on earth. He builds his distillery in the hills of Lynchburg, Tennessee, and his name goes on the bottle. 50 years later, the brand leans into that story hard. Small, black and white print ads feature weathered white locals in denim overalls sitting on benches, playing checkers. It was timeless and unmistakably American. Postcards from Lynchburg becomes the longest-running advertising campaign in history, and it works because it sells something people desperately want. The idea that greatness comes from one man, one place, one unbroken tradition. At the heart of that tradition is the Lincoln County process. Before Jack Daniel's ever sees a barrel, the raw spirit gets filtered through 10 feet of sugar maple charcoal. That filtration strips out the harshness and leaves behind the smoothness the brand has built its entire identity around. It's the only thing that legally separates Tennessee whiskey from bourbon. The official story says Jack learned it from the preacher. That's what the tours said. That's what the television commercials were still saying in the early 2000s. That was the foundation of everything. There's just one problem. It isn't true. Before Jack Daniel ever set foot on that farm, another man was already running the still. His name was Nathan Green, though everyone who knew him called him Nearest. Born in Maryland around 1820, he was enslaved by a firm called Landis and Green, who hired out his labor to the preacher, Daniel Call, for a fee. Green wasn't just a worker at the distillery. He was the master of it, already known across Lincoln County as the finest whiskey maker anyone had encountered. When Call introduced young Jack Daniel to Green, he wasn't making a casual introduction. He looked at Green and said plainly, "Uncle Nearest is the best whiskey maker that I know of. Help me teach this boy everything." So Green did. What he taught Jack was the Lincoln County process, and where that technique actually came from matters enormously. Food historians trace the charcoal filtration method back to West African traditions, where charcoal had been used for generations to filter water and purify food. Enslaved Africans carried that knowledge across the Atlantic. Green had taken it and refined it into a precise, repeatable industrial process, burning sugar maple wood into charcoal and filtering the raw spirit through deep vats before it ever touched an oak barrel. The smoothness the world would later pay billions for wasn't a Tennessee mountain secret. It was African intellectual property, sitting on a preacher's farm in Lincoln County, held by a man who had no legal right to own what his own mind had built. The two of them worked side by side for years, through the entire Civil War, while the country around them tore itself apart over the very question of whether people like Nearest Green were human beings or property. Green kept making whiskey, Jack kept learning. By the time the war ended, the student had become one of the most skilled distillers in the region, with a business ready to grow, and the man who made that possible was still technically owned by someone else. When the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865 and Green became a free man, Daniel didn't replace him. He asked him to stay. When he opened his own distillery, he named Green as its first master distiller, making Nearest Green the first documented African American to hold that title anywhere in the United States. It was an extraordinary gesture for the time and the place, and it was also the last public acknowledgement the Green family would receive for 150 years. Green's sons joined the operation, along with other sons whose names vary across the historical record, and then their own children after them. For every generation that followed, the company's public acknowledgement of that contribution was the same: total silence. Most people, when they hear this story, go looking for a villain. One executive, in one room, who made a cold, deliberate decision to bury Nearest Green. That person doesn't exist. What happened instead is more mundane and more damning. Jack Daniel understood the commercial reality of selling whiskey in the post-Reconstruction South. The story of a product was inseparable from the image of who made it. So he played the role: the waxed mustache, the knee-length silk-lined coats, the World's Fair gold medal framed as the triumph of one man's Tennessee genius. In a region still hardening its racial lines after the Civil War, authentic Southern whiskey required a white face on the bottle and a white man in the legend. Nearest Green had to be invisible, not because anyone hated him, but because visibility would have cost them money. When Daniel died, the distillery passed to his nephew, Lem Motlow, who fought the brand through one of the most difficult periods in its history. Tennessee's state prohibition laws arrived in 1910, a decade before national prohibition, forcing Motlow to relocate operations to St. Louis. When national prohibition hit in 1920, he kept the name alive by selling pre-existing stock to pharmacies as medicinal whiskey while running mule auctions to stay afloat. The Lynchburg distillery didn't reopen until 1938. His family sold it to Brown-Forman Corporation in 1956. The brand's value sat entirely in the legend, the lore, and the story. A story built, technically and operationally, by a man whose name wasn't part of it. 2 years before that sale, the advertising agency Gardner had launched the Postcards from Lynchburg campaign. Across 50 years of advertising, it did not feature the man who actually invented the product. Television commercials into the early 2000s were still crediting Jack Daniel with developing the Lincoln County process himself. Then consider what happened in 2013. Tennessee House Bill 1084 created a legal definition for Tennessee whiskey. Any spirit using that name must use the Lincoln County process. The mechanism is straightforward. The legislation established a production requirement, set a minimum proof, and mandated the use of new charred oak barrels, effectively codifying a manufacturing standard into state law. Jack Daniels lobbied hard for it. The consequence is this: a filtration method rooted in West African tradition, invented by an enslaved man, is now a government-enforced competitive barrier, protecting the brand that spent decades erasing him. The law arrived 4 years before the company said his name publicly. Green's intellectual property became a legal moat. The industry moved on. The most revealing part is that nobody in Lynchburg was hiding anything. Green's family passed the oral history down through every generation. A 1967 biography of Jack Daniel documented the mentorship in detail and became required reading for distillery executives. The story circulated openly through the town, through the community, through every family who had lived alongside it for a century. It never disappeared. It just never left the county. Nobody had to suppress it. The version of the story that generated billions told itself, and the true version had no platform, no marketing budget, and no one willing to pay for one. In June 2016, journalist Clay Rizin published a piece in the New York Times. For the first time in 150 years, the world outside Lynchburg heard the name Nearest Green. A woman named Fawn Weaver came across the article while traveling in Singapore. She flew straight to Lynchburg and took 3 separate distillery tours. Not one of them mentioned Green. She asked the guides about him directly. They had nothing. So she built her own research operation. More than 20 historians, archivists, and archaeologists, 12 months of work, over 10,000 original documents pulled from 5 states. What they confirmed wasn't just what the oral history had always said. It went further. Green hadn't simply taught Daniel how to distill. He had been formally designated the first master distiller of the Jack Daniel Distillery as a free man, and the friendship between the two men was genuine. This wasn't exploitation wrapped in politeness. It was a real partnership that the industry chose not to remember. Brown-Forman moved quickly once the story broke. By 2017, they officially recognized Green as the distillery's first master distiller, updated the tours, and began training guides to use the word mentor. Mark McCallum, then president of Jack Daniel's Brands, called it absolutely critical that Green's story be incorporated into the Jack Daniel's narrative. The company used the right language. They used the word partnership. They called it an important story to tell. And they were right. What they didn't say was why it had taken 150 years and a New York Times article to get there. Phil Epps, Jack Daniel's global brand director, told the Times he didn't believe it had ever been a conscious decision to leave Green out of the story. The erasure was so complete, so naturally embedded in how a profitable brand operates, that the people running it could look back over 150 years and honestly say, nobody chose it. It just happened. That isn't an excuse. It is a precise description of how institutional erasure works. Fawn Weaver founded Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey in 2017, raised $225 million from over 160 individual investors, and deliberately turned down venture capital to keep full control of the company and its story. By 2024, Uncle Nearest had crossed a $1.1 billion valuation, the fastest-growing American whiskey brand in history. Leading that company is Victoria Edie Butler, Nearest Green's great-great-granddaughter, and the first known African-American woman to serve as master blender in the whiskey industry. She is building the wealth that was denied to her family for 150 years, one bottle at a time, with her great-great-grandfather's name above the door. Jack Daniel's remains the most valuable asset in Brown-Forman's portfolio. 3 of Green's direct descendants still work at the distillery he built. 2 brands now share the same origin story. Only one of them was built by the family that made it possible. The correction didn't happen because the industry evolved or because Brown-Forman did the work. It happened because a journalist published a story, and a woman flew to Tennessee and spent 12 months in archives that a billion-dollar corporation had never bothered to open. That's what justice looks like in this industry. not reckoning, not restitution. Just a website update and a press cycle that cost nothing. The question isn't whether Jack Daniels did something uniquely evil. The question is how many bottles you've raised in good faith to a story that was never true, and how many are sitting behind bars right now, selling the same silence under different labels. If you liked this story, check out how Budweiser was dethroned as the best-selling beer in America.